On March 4th, 1519, the son of martial adventurer and ruler of Kabul Babur was born. He was named Hindal, taker of India. Since Hindal was born in the same year, Babur requested the submission of Ibrahim, the young sultan of Delhi, to persuade Ibrahim to submit. Babur sent him gifts and an ultimatum. But those did not work on the young sultan, whose family had ruled northern India for generations in a territory known as Hindustan. Babur claimed the right to rule northern India because his ancestor, Timur, had conquered Delhi a century earlier. But those Indians who were familiar with the name of Timur, few as they were weary as they had only heard the stories of his raids and the devastation he brought to the land. Ibrahim's governor in Lahore denied access to Babur and his small war party, and he did not even bother to notify the Sultan of his arrival. In his memoirs, known as the Baburnama, Babur complained that the people of Hindustan had no wisdom as they did not dare to stand against their enemies, nor did they know how to respond to the act of friendship. Thus declined. This Central Asian martial adventurer could only return home to enjoy his newborn son. However, 7 years later, he would invade Hindustan and kill the young Sultan Ibrahim. With this conquest, Babur came to possess the royal treasuries of the former sultanate, which were rich enough to give him power over the whole region. The Mughal Empire was thus born. Babur's true name was Zahir-ud-Din, which means defender of faith in Arabic. His date of birth was recorded as being on February 14th, 1483, in Andijan, which is in today's Uzbekistan. On his father's side, he was a descendant of Timur of the Timurid Empire. On his mother's side, he was a direct descendant of Genghis Khan of the Mongol Empire. With ancestors like that, it is no wonder Babur strived to rule his whole life. He was the eldest son of the ruler of the Fergana Valley, Umar Sheikh Mirza II of the Barlas tribe. The title of Mirza was often used by the leaders of various Persian tribes, such as Babur's father, but later it would transform, and only the princes of the royal family of the Mughals would be honored with the title, as well as some distinguished military commanders. The Barlas tribe was of Mongolian origin, but they did embrace Turkic and Persian culture as their identity and Islam as their faith. Scholars believe that because of this mixture of cultures, specifically Mongolian and Arabic, Babur was able to gain the support of many people from Central Asia, especially Iranians and those of Turkic origin. His army was ethnically diverse as it included Persians, Arabs, Afghans, Barlas, and other Turco-Mongol tribes of Central Asia. It is believed that his true name, Zahir-ud-Din, was too complicated to pronounce for his multi-ethnic army, and that it was them who gave him the nickname Babur, a Persian word that means tiger. In 1494, when he was only 11 years old, Babur's father died. However, even at that young age as a ruler, Babur managed to secure his rightful place as the leader of the Fergana Valley. However, his position was threatened by his own uncles, and they were not the only ones who threatened the boy's position. A part of the people he now ruled believed that his younger brother, Jahangir, would be a more formidable leader. It is important to understand that the Central Asian peoples did not follow the usual primogeniture laws of inheritance, where the rule is passed from the father to his eldest son, as long as the male child was recognized as legitimate. He had the right to inherit the rule. As such, it was not unusual in Central Asia to see brothers at war with each other. Babur had the help of his grandmother, Isin Dulit Begum. She was his mother's mother and the first wife of Yunus Khan of Mogulistan. All of this contributed to a dynastic turmoil, which was common within the ruling families. Warrior peoples. These clans were constantly at conflict, and after the passing of Babur's father, they saw an opportunity to gain new territories. This is this cultural setting in which Babur grew up in, and when he was 15, he planned his first military conquest. He wanted to conquer Samarkand, a city that lay in the Bokhara region. For the next 7 months, his army besieged the city. The losses were heavy on both sides, but Babur managed to gain the submission of the neighboring forts. While moving his army from one position to the other, the citizens of Samarkand wrongly thought he was retreating, and they decided to attack. They sent their soldiers outside of the city, and Babur had the opportunity to confront them on the open field. Finally, he was able to show off his military power, and his cavalry overran the army of Samarkand. However, the city still endured, and winter was fast approaching. Unwilling to leave the territory, Babur decided to spend the winter with his army in one of the forts that submitted to him. This pause of the siege allowed Baysankar Mirza, the Sultan of Bokhara, to ask Muhammad Shaybani, an Uzbek warrior, for help. He led his army of around 3,000 men to Samarkand, where he met Babur for the first time. Shaybani would later become a true nemesis of Babur. However, disappointed by the cold reception he encountered in the city of Samarkand, Shaybani left after only a few days. Seeing that his last hope, the Uzbek army, was gone, Baysankar Mirza abandoned the city and his kingdom. With a small retinue of followers, he left for Afghanistan. When their leader left, the citizens of Samarkand had no other choice than to surrender to the one who had besieged them, and Babur finally took the city without any opposition. Samarkand used to be the capital of Emperor Timur, and in the 16th century, it continued to be one of the biggest, richest, and most respected cities. And now, 15-year-old Babur ruled it. However, the long siege cost the city, and there was not enough plunder for Babur's army, so many soldiers deserted due to lack of payment. There was not enough food for the citizens either, and the fertile fields outside of the city were not plowed. Farmers had no seeds to plant, making the upcoming harvest difficult. If the troubles in Samarkand were not enough, back home in the Fergana Valley, the nobles who supported his brother rebelled, and Jahangir Mirza was proclaimed the new king. With the few troops he was left with, Babur marched to reclaim his kingdom. But since the troops were dissatisfied, they eventually left him. Babur was now without an army, without Samarkand, and without his kingdom. So, for the next 3 years, Babur gathered an army. He recruited troops from all the ethnicities of Central Asia. Finally, once his army was strong enough, he launched another attack on Samarkand, and his siege was successful, as he managed to take and rule it for almost 100 days. But his rival Muhammad Shaybani was back with no intention to leave. This time, he wanted to conquer the city for himself, not for a sultan who treated him as an inferior. During the 3 years that Babur had spent gathering his army, Shaybani led a series of successful campaigns with which he gained power among the Uzbeks. In 1501, Babur had to negotiate for peace. The situation was indeed very bad, as he not only had to offer his sister Khanzada Begum's hand in marriage to Muhammad Shaybani, but he also had to leave the city. Babur had nowhere to go, so he decided to try and take his old kingdom back, the Fergana Valley. But his army, already tired and decimated by the fighting at Samarkand, stood no chance to win back Fergana. In fact, Babur lost everything but his life. With a small group of warriors, he escaped and tried to find his luck in Tashkent, a city ruled by one of his uncles. However, he was not welcomed there, and he wrote in his memoirs how he was often humiliated by his uncle and his court. He lived in poverty, and he only survived due to the compassion of his friends and strangers. Only 10 years after gaining control over Fergana, Babur was now a prince in exile. One of Babur's paternal uncles ruled Kabul, but he died in 1501, leaving an opportunity for the prince in exile to reclaim his throne, as the only heir of Kabul was just an infant. However, a rivaling Timurid prince was quicker in seizing the city, marrying the daughter of the previous ruler to make his conquest legitimate. But that did not help, as he was still seen as a usurper, and the people he ruled resented him. When Babur gathered an army of 200 loyal followers, the people of Kabul welcomed him as a savior. After all, he was the nephew to their previous ruler, which gave him all the legitimacy he needed. With ease, Babur dispatched the usurper and started ruling his newly gained kingdom. In 1506, Babur allied himself with his cousin, Sultan Husain Mirza Baikara of Herat, and their intention was to attack Muhammad Shaybani together. However, Baikara died the same year, and his sons did not want to go to war. Babur stayed in Herat for the next 2 months, as it was the capital of Eastern Muslim culture at the time. There, he learned about history and language, which inspired him to start writing his memoirs. After Babur left, the city of Herat was conquered by Shaybani, and Baikara's sons were killed. Babur was now the most powerful ruler of the Timurid dynasty, and as such, he started calling himself Padshah, meaning the great king or emperor. Many relatives and princes of the neighboring regions sought shelter in Kabul, as Shaybani ravaged their lands. The ancestral lands of the Timurid dynasty were now all conquered by the Uzbek leader Shaybani, who became a real threat to Kabul. Some princes and nobles of Kabul did not believe Babur would be able to protect them from the attacks of the Uzbeks, and they organized a rebellion. However, Babur was able to quell it pretty quickly. 2 years later, though, another rebellion started, and this time, the military generals of Kabul managed to expel Babur. However, Babur still had loyal friends in the city who advocated for him, and the leaders of the rebels switched to his side, allowing Babur to take over the city once more. In the meantime, Shaybani was killed in 1510 during the conflict he had with Ismail I, the Shah of Shia Safavid Persia. Uzbek power was diminishing, and Babur allied himself with Shah Ismail to regain his ancestral territories of Central Asia. In 1513, he left for Samarkand to lay siege to it. For the third time, there, he was reunited with his sister, who had been forced to marry Babur's enemy Shaybani. Babur ruled Samarkand for the next 3 years, but in 1514, he returned to Kabul after he lost Samarkand to the Uzbeks for the third time. Babur spent the next 11 years ruling in relative peace. He took the time to reorganize his army in preparation for the conquest of Hindustan, and he carried out small raids in the territory of northern India and successfully dealt with small rebellions in the area of modern Afghanistan. Even though the regions were relatively peaceful, Babur undertook the long and demanding task of modernizing his army. The Uzbeks remained a threat, and as Babur records in his memoirs, he wanted to put some space between his people and their enemies. Although some of his people found refuge in Badakhshan, just north of Kabul, Babur looked to India, as it was a much farther and safer place. Since Babur had lost Samarkand, he chose to dedicate himself to conquering the territories of India. As a first step, he started reorganizing his fractured army. In 1519, he was ready to embark on his first campaign to today's Pakistan. Following the footsteps of his predecessor Timur, Babur wanted to spread his influence to Punjab, as these regions used to be a part of the Timurid Empire. At this time, parts of northern India were ruled by Sultan Ibrahim of the Lodi dynasty. However, Ibrahim's rule was weak, and his empire deteriorated. Many of the followers of the Indian Sultan decided to switch sides and join Babur. It was at this point that Babur sent an ambassador with gifts to the young Sultan asking him to recognize Babur as his supreme ruler. However, the ambassador was detained in Lahore and did not even see the Sultan. Instead, he spent many months as a prisoner. In 1524, Babur started his main campaign to take over Punjab, but he was met there by the forces of Ibrahim Lodi, which had disposed of his uncle, Daulat Khan Lodi, the ruler of Punjab. In Lahore, the armies met, and the Lodi army was forced to retreat, but Babur was not satisfied by this turn of events. Instead, he burned the city for the next 2 days and then installed Alam Khan, another rebellious uncle of Ibrahim Lodi, as the governor. Alam lost the city once Babur left with his army, and he had to run to Kabul. There, he was met by Babur's army, who helped him reach his brother, Daulat Khan Lodi. Together, Ibrahim's uncles besieged Delhi. However, the young sultan easily defeated the united army, and Babur realized that Punjab would be much harder to conquer than he initially thought. During the year 1525, Babur was staying in Peshawar, a trade center on the route between India and Central Asia. There, he received news that Daulat Khan Lodi had abandoned him and joined his nephew, Sultan Ibrahim. Babur decided to confront Daulat Khan, and he marched his troops to what is known to history as the First Battle of Panipat. After Babur crossed the Indus River in November 1526 and entered Punjab with his mighty army, Daulat Khan surrendered without a fight as his army abandoned him. Upon seeing the force of Babur, Daulat Khan was pardoned once he granted the rule over Punjab to Babur. The army continued on, and on April 20th, 1526, they reached Panipat, which was only 90 kilometers, almost 56 miles away from Delhi, where the army of Sultan Ibrahim Lodi was waiting. Babur records that Ibrahim's army was superior. It numbered 100,000 soldiers and 100 elephants against Babur's 15,000 men. But the numbers did not deter Babur. Instead, he devised a plan. He used the city of Panipat as protection. For his right flank, a trench was also dug out and covered with branches to hide it to serve as a defense for the left flank of the army. In the center, between the city and the trench, Babur placed 700 carts that were tied together with ropes, and they served as a defense for the artillery. This was essential to protect as his modernized army relied on the use of gunpowder, as he employed Turkish cannon specialists and had created the matchlock infantry. Babur's army was placed between the city and the trench, and those defenses created a narrow approach for Ibrahim's soldiers. The Sultan was forced to reorganize his army, as he had hoped for an open field battle. Babur took the opportunity of Ibrahim's confusion to deploy a tactic known as taluma, in which he split his army into smaller units and created front and rear flanks. Because his army was much smaller than Ibrahim's, his only chance was to surround the enemy from all sides. Ibrahim relied heavily on his elephants and cavalry, but Babur had modernized his army and used cannons against them. Two flanks, a side and a rear, attacked Lodi's army, massacring them. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but Babur was able to win the battle in just 3 hours against a much stronger enemy by using a mixture of Ottoman and Mongolian tactics. Sultan Ibrahim Lodi was killed during the battle, and thus, the Delhi Sultanate ceased to exist. Babur was now the ruler of northern India, and by taking the territories that used to belong to the Lodi dynasty, he set the foundations for his future Mughal Empire. But he was challenged by neighboring magnates who wanted to take advantage of the opportunity of regional instability and take Lodi's throne for themselves. Before setting in motion the construction of his empire, he had to defeat these new challengers, especially one named Rana Sanga, the ruler of Mewar. Rana is the title used only by absolute Hindu monarchs. It is equivalent to an emperor, unlike Raja, which is equivalent to a king. In this context, the title of Maharaja can be translated as High King and was also used like the European title the Great, such as Alexander the Great or Alfred the Great. The two armies met at the Battle of Kanwa on March 17, 1527. Rana Sanga recognized the strength of his enemy Babur, and to fight him, he allied with all the kings of Rajasthan, a state of northern India, who either joined the battle personally or sent a contingent of soldiers. The alliance also included Mahmud Lodi, the younger brother of Ibrahim Lodi. He was proclaimed the Sultan of the Afghans shortly after his brother's death, and he brought 10,000 of his soldiers to the battle. Hassan Khan Muadi, the ruler of Mewat, brought 12,000 soldiers. Others who joined the army were rulers of the various cities of Rajasthan, including Harauti, Dungarpur, Dundhar, Jailur, and Sirhi. The Rajput-Afghan alliance had a mission of expelling Babur, who was seen as a Turkic intruder from the Lodi Empire. Babur's memoirs record Rana Sanga's army numbering 200,000 men. However, historians consider this number to be an exaggeration and believe that the Rajput army had only 40,000 soldiers. However, this exaggeration most likely means that the alliance had a much larger army than Babur. No matter what the real numbers were, Babur's army was outnumbered once more. His men suffered from low morale, and to raise it, Babur gave a religious meaning to the battle. He proclaimed that he would live in total abstinence from wine from that day forward. He even broke all his drinking cups and spilled all the liquor on the ground to show his intentions were sincere. His actions not only impacted his army, but his enemies as well. The battle took place on March 16, 1527, near Kanwa in the Agra district of Uttar Pradesh. Babur reused the tactics from the previous battle in Panipat, as he used carts to create a defense for his artillery. His matchlock infantry hid behind wheeled shields made out of rawhides stretched on tripods. This way, they would have protection, and they could easily advance or retreat. With further modernization of his army, Babur had no difficulty defeating his enemy, who fought in the traditional way. Yet again, he surrounded the enemy army and ordered his artillery and matchlocks to advance. The carts, which protected the artillery, were pushed forward, and the cannons followed. The allied army of Rana Sanga fought hard, but Raja Shaladitya of northeastern Malva deserted and took his soldiers to Babur's side. Rana was defeated, and to show his disrespect toward his enemy, Babur ordered a tower of enemy skulls to be built. These towers were common Ottoman tactics of frightening their adversaries, but they also served as memorials to the battles. Rana Sanga escaped the battlefield alive, and he found refuge in Chittor, but the alliance he built collapsed after this battle, never again to be united against their common enemy. Scholars comment that Rana Sanga would have probably defeated Babur if there were no cannons in Babur's artillery, as Rana held the superiority in numbers, not two. Mention the famous bravery of the Rajput soldiers. Rana died the next year. In late January 1528, in Chittor, he wanted to confront Babur once more, but his generals considered such a move to be suicide. Instead of openly opposing him, they decided to poison him. However, the word that Rana planned to renew the conflict reached Babur, and he decided to attack one of the allied forces, Medini Rai. The ruler of eastern Malwa, that he hoped that by defeating the allies of Rana Sanga, he would be able to isolate Rana Sanga and deal with him easily. So, Babur marched his army to Chundari in January of 1528, which fell after just 2 days to avoid capture and enslavement. The women and children of Chundari committed the ritual of Jauhar, a self-immolation ceremony.